Okay, it is 12 Eastern time, so let's jump right in and get started. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'd like to welcome you all to our session today. I know many of you guys that are attending or have signed up are extremely busy, especially for those of you that have had to deal with this whole coronavirus situation and incident response. So thank you for taking the time. And so with that in mind, let's jump right in. We'll be timely. We'll send you on your way today, and we're going to make sure you walk away from this with some specific and helpful tips that are going to help you get ready for FY21. I'd like to open with an introduction, just a little bit of background. So our company is called Plan 4, and together Plan 4 Technologies and Plan 4 Healthcare, we are focused on smarter planning for better results. We are experts in the planning methods that we're going to cover today. We have built an entire proprietary and unique platform to support planning with thousands of users on board. We've worked nationwide with a very diverse customer base from coast to coast. And primarily we're focused on public sector, although not exclusively. But what I think you guys will see today is that the methods that we're going to cover will work anywhere. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if it's government, nonprofit, private sector, large or small business. These are all tried and true methods that I think you guys will all find beneficial. And like I said, our goal is to send you off today with some very practical tips that you can use to get ready for the coming year. An introduction of myself as the presenter today. My name is Seth Sinclair. I am one of the founders of this company and one of the developers and authors of some of the processes and tools we're going to discuss today. After working as an advisor, coach, and consultant for many, many years, I observed some common challenges and gaps in planning and execution that I just saw over and over and thought, you know what, let's do something about this. Let's build some methods, let's build some solutions to help organizations overcome some of these challenges and gaps. And for the last 10 years of my career, I've had near total dedication to the methods that we're going to cover today. I think at this point, I've seen it all, good and bad, in the planning realm. But again, my hope here is to help share some of what we've learned in a way that will give you guys some good tools and tips that you'll be able to put into practice. Okay, for today in our hour together, these are the topics that we're going to cover. If I can just let the screen catch up. We are going to talk about what does effective planning look like. We're going to talk about this concept of business planning and how it works. We've got our 6 specific tips. Each one we're going to address and get into some detail, leave you with a couple thoughts, make sure there's an opportunity for any final questions, and we will close with a summary. Because this is a webinar format, I will primarily be presenting. You're going to hear a lot of me talking today. However, GoToWebinar does have capability for asking questions, so hopefully you see that in your control panel there. There is the ability to either raise your hand or submit a question. Some of my colleagues are on the line and may be able to help me keep an eye on those. I'll do my best to check periodically. So don't hesitate to either try to ask a question through the tool or chat. I will pause at points and see if there are questions verbally over the line. By default, you will be muted. So just know that and be aware that you might have to actually click in order to be able to ask a question. There will be 3 polls during the session. So keep your eye peeled. I'm going to ask for your input. I've got 3 questions and would absolutely love to gather your feedback on those questions as we go through this. And then when we're done, for all of you that were able to register, we will make sure that you receive a recording of the full presentation that you can share. And you'll also have access to the slide set, and I think you'll find that valuable. There is a lot of content in here that we're going to cover today. And actually, through GoToWebinar, there is a handout feature, and this slide deck is already linked through there. So if you're set up and have that capability, you are welcome to go ahead and download it. Otherwise, we will be following up. So with all that said, all of our intro, all of our background, let's get to business. And our first topic of today is, what does effective planning look like? I think what you're going to find here are some very common sense components. So let's just look at them one by one. Effective planning is comprehensive. It is linking together all elements of planning in an organization together. It's inclusive. It involves the key players in the organization, many stakeholders. That's not just leadership, it's not just management, it's not just finance. There are many, many stakeholders in an organization that need to be a part of the planning experience if you're going to truly be inclusive. Good planning is transparent, nothing behind the curtain, all conducted openly, a process through which when there's questions that is the ability to provide evidence to show that there's been a process, and again, that it's conducted openly. Of course, accuracy. An accurate planning method is one that's going to use tested and proven methods, quality data, so that it produces meaningful results. Consistency. Being able to each year approach with some reusable processes and tools, making it as predictable as possible. That's not only for your benefit, for those folks who are administrators, who are those tasked with conducting or leading planning in some way, shape, or form, but for all of those stakeholders, so that each year we're not reinventing the wheel and having to embark on a whole new planning journey. So consistency is key. Efficiency, we're going to talk about this later. You need a planning process that is optimized in terms of its level of effort that fits the organization. You can't afford to spend too much time on planning and have that time be wasted. So we'll talk about what it looks like to be efficient in your planning. And certainly last but not least is effectiveness. You must have a planning process that yields a usable output, clarity. That's a theme we're going to hammer on today. There's got to be clarity and a true foundation for execution. So like I said before, all common sense, all things I think we would agree would be part of a effective planning approach, but I think we would also agree that these are difficult to achieve. Why? Because most organizations are either too fragmented or overwhelmed, or they lack the maturity or processes and systems to get all of this right. But the good news is that's why we're here today. We're going to share best practices that are going to address these elements. This business planning methodology that we're going to use as the basis for our conversation today addresses all of these attributes. So, building up to our 6 tips, because I'm using a business planning framework to provide those 6 tips, I've got to take a step back and give some context on what business planning is. And what I want to say is I think business planning for most folks already means something. I think for a lot of people, they think almost of like the business plan. If I have an idea and I'm going to sit down and maybe I'm an entrepreneur, I want to start a new enterprise. And so I'm going to write something called a business plan where I vision my idea. I explore my idea. I look at trade-offs. I look at cost projections. And that's good. We're building it similar, but we are reframing and redefining that in a way. It's not just that. It's more than that. Business planning, as we have evolved it, is a true integration of planning approaches. And it utilizes both top-down and bottom-up methods to help an organization link its strategy, its operations, and its budget each year. So think of it like this. It builds on strategic planning. It doesn't replace strategic planning, but it builds on strategic planning. It helps define specific operational tactics. It pulls in and ties in budgeting and connects all 3 of those together in a meaningful way. Remember on the last slide, I said good planning has to be comprehensive. So that's inherent in business planning, is linking together these other elements. And so it looks something like this. You ask the question, it's informed by what are an organization's goals and priorities. That's the strategy piece. Then it asks the questions, what can this organization realistically afford? What can be supported? Let me see if my screen will catch up with me here. Hopefully it will. That's the budget piece. And then it asks the questions, well, what are we going to tactically do? And what guidance and resources are we going to give to our managers so that we have clarity around operations? And when you link those elements together in one planning approach, obviously it's going to have a big impact. It's going to create alignment, it's going to create clarity, and it's going to create a foundation for execution. So that's what business planning is by definition. And how does it work? So very, very straightforward and common sense. Every year, this is something that an organization is going to have to do every year. It's going to have to think about those goals and priorities, and we're going to talk more about what that entails. There's a lot of things that are going to shape those goals and priorities. That may be at a national level or an enterprise level or an administration level, regional, local. All of those need to be taken into account. And then there's this financial analysis, this look at affordability. What can we afford based on what we know today? Those are the top-down inputs that help frame business planning. So each year, an organization is going to have to take a look at those. And then from there, we move into the bottom-up aspect of planning, which is looking outward across the organization and saying to our managers at the department level, service level, unit level, office level, doesn't matter what you call it. And you're going to task them with identifying their plan, their vision for the year, their tactics, and their resource needs or resource proposals. And they're going to be informed by those priorities and financial assumptions. When that is done, leadership from a management position has the ability to look across everything. The table is now set for true decision making. They look at those priorities. They look at these business plans in the context of priorities. They're mindful of their financial constraints, and through that, they actually make some very specific, tangible decisions that are an output from that process. So through this model, the questions are answered. What are we trying to achieve? What can we afford? What needs to be done? And how are we going to organize tactically around that so we can execute? And that is how business planning works every single year. You got to do it every year. Strategy, the time horizon on that may be multi-year. But for this, you are going to revisit this every single year. All right. So that's the background. And I promised you guys two things. I hope I promised everybody two things. And one is I was going to give you 6 tips. So it's time to get right into those. And the second thing I promised you is it wasn't going to be a sales pitch. We're simply here to share knowledge. And I hope you find me true to my word as we go through this. At the end, I will simply mention some of the resources that we have available if you'd like to look at those. But right now, we're going to get into these tips, and we're going to leave you with some helpful knowledge. So the first one, get the right people involved. We talked about inclusion. We talked about comprehensiveness. So let's look at how participation is a crucial factor in making sure that we achieve those goals. So at a most minimal level, you have to have some executive sponsorship. And at the most minimal level, that might only be one person. You're going to have someone, it's usually the CFO, but someone from the finance team involved. And that's essential because, as you saw, there are the budgeting aspects of this. And then you have to have some kind of input, even if it's the most basic input from your management tier. And that would be if you have departments or services, however you're organized, offices. Like I said, there's many different organizational structures, but the bottom line is these are the functional units inside of your organization. And each of those typically is going to have a director or a manager, whatever you call it. There's got to be something from them, even if it's minimal. So this is our most basic. This is the lowest level of interaction that you need in order to function in a business planning process. But let's build on that. Let's ratchet it up a little bit here. As we move to the better scenario, we've got an appointed lead or champion or process owner inside this organization that is responsible for not making all the decisions, but for chairing and organizing the planning process. We bring in our administrative management function. These are our administrative officers. These are the people that know data on a day-to-day basis. They're very, very close to operations. So we're going to pull them in and get them hands-on. We're going to include the full finance team, especially the folks that work on the budget side, because they are crucial knowledge holders inside of this process. So we need them to be hands-on. And then bringing in human resource. You're going to see later, we're going to talk about how crucial it is in a true integrated planning model to know about staffing and FTE. So we've got to get our HRO in there because they're going to have the data that's going to help feed and inform that. And then as we build even further, if we get to what I call the best, it's all of these now. We're going to have everybody that's represented on the screen here. It's the full executive team, full sponsorship, full engagement from all of our executive leadership team members. Other planning leaders in the organization. I single out strategic or capital planning here because what I observe a lot is an organization will embark on a strategic planning process that's more the visionary. And then they'll do their budget planning, and it happens in a completely separate lane. And then over here, they're going to do capital planning, and it happens in its own lane, and they never really link up. And I think that's a huge wasted opportunity. So let's bring everybody. You still may be responsible for specific planning aspects and responsibilities, but you're now part of one uniform process where those things link up. Revenue, okay, whatever you call that for the organization, but a revenue coordinator, whoever is the one that's making the projections, helping to try to influence the organization's budget allocation for it or its revenue projection for the year. And then last but not least, most organizations have some kind of a process owner for different asset areas. And I'm, got examples here like travel or education or logistics or other assets. Because through this process, there's an opportunity to address all of those needs. It's best, it's most inclusive if you have those folks involved. So think of it like this. Minimally, it's primarily a CFO-driven model. And we're going to talk later about complexity and sophistication. It's going to be a less complex model. Better is what I would call more of a bridging to where we begin to connect the dots. There's more engagement, more comprehensiveness. And then in our best model, we're really fully integrated. We have all of the key stakeholders across the organization represented in the planning model. So what I would encourage you guys to do is ask the question, where is my organization today? Where do we stand? Are we a minimalist or are we fully integrated? Are we at the best level? And I would add the note is it is very important to keep in mind that your planning philosophy has a lot to do with this. If your organization views planning as, I'll use the term centralized, and the responsibility lies very much within perhaps the CFO organization or the management organization, then that's going to put the burden on that organization, and it's going to reduce the engagement and interaction with the other stakeholders. But if you're more decentralized, that's going to affect both aspects of planning, how you collect data and who's involved in that and who produces what, who submits what. And it's also going to affect the execution side. Who is accountable in this organization for planning and executing? Very interesting question. Some organizations we work with, everybody looks at the CFO. They say that CFO is the person who's responsible for the financial health of this organization. Others will say, no, we all are responsible for the financial health of this organization. The decisions that our managers make on a day-to-day basis affect the financial health of this organization, the operational performance of this organization. My experience tells me the latter is what's really true. And if you don't go down that path, you end up putting a massive burden on your CFO and the finance team to try to, reposition an organization financially. So I would advocate that you strive to get all of these folks involved and that you build this more inclusive model of planning. So tip number one, get all these folks involved. All right, we're going to move on to tip number two, which is all about timing. Get your timing right. If you time your planning process each year right, it's going to help you. It's going to prevent suffering, and it's going to prevent inefficiency. So, timing. What are we talking about here? I am assuming, for the sake of this conversation, because most of the folks we invited are from the public sector, that we're talking about a fiscal year start date of 10/1. So many of you may have that in mind. Now, I'll say that everything I'm saying would apply just as well to someone who's got a calendar year or a July or June 1. Doesn't matter. So the timing is relative to your fiscal year start date. But let's talk about what it looks like to start early. Okay, so and what I mean by starting early, let's say you are focused on that 10-1 and you're already starting to do this business planning process as early as maybe even January, February, March, April. That's what I consider early. So what's good about that? Well, you're certainly getting a head start, which is very proactive. You have an opportunity to decompress your planning timeline, meaning stretch it out. The organization's busy, there's a lot going on. So instead of having to cram our annual business planning into one small time frame, we've got the ability to spread it out. And then the biggest pro in my book is it gives you a runway to complete your planning before a new fiscal year begins. And that is very powerful and I think very important. Now, that being said, if you start early, it comes with some cons. Some of the data you use in this planning process, it will become stale, meaning I set up my initial planning data in February and we're still working on plans in June and July. So some of your data becomes a moving target and you have to refresh and update as you go through. And that can have consequences because then for those that are interacting with planning, it's kind of like moving the ball and asking them to keep up with that. So that can be a headache that can add to the effort. It becomes harder to project moving forward. The longer the time horizon we have, the harder it is to look into the future and make good quality projections. And then last, but certainly not least, for an organization who's trying to balance in that affordability and revenue element, it's going to be harder for them to make those projections because we're further away from the year and just some of the data is not going to be known. All right, so what about starting late? Well, and by late, so just to provide some context, by late we mean starting like, we're not going to start until September, okay? Even though it's a 10-1 start date, we're going to wait until later in the year. So pros, more data is available. You're going to have more current year data. You're going to know more about that revenue. Projections and assumptions are very much more likely to be available to you. And it is easier. It's easier to make a projection because we're getting close to the year. We have more data, more framework from which to project. But some obvious cons, it means that you are likely to lag your planning and decision-making process into the year. So you'd actually be crossing over. In our case, we're talking about FY21. You'd be getting into FY21 without having completed your planning process. And I think that can be an issue because then everybody's kind of limping into the year with a lack of clarity. And who knows how far into the year you'll get without having the planning framework in place. So there's no right or wrong answer. These are balanced. I think there's, like we said, pros and cons to both. And I would ask you, what I would challenge you to do is think about what is going on in my organization that might force me or lead me to choose one or the other. And this year is a phenomenal example because so many organizations went into complete crisis mode with the incident response with COVID-19. And because of that, maybe this is a year where it makes sense to start a little later. So I think that's the type of consideration to keep in mind when you're planning out your process. Now, I do want to give you guys very specifically a timeline that you can look at that I believe balances both. This falls right down the middle between early and late and lines you up to be well positioned to begin a new fiscal year with your planning and budgeting completed. So I'm going to run through this quickly. Now, notice I've got it starting as early as March, which I said was early, but I'm talking here about starting to set some clarity around those. You can call them the strategic level or even the organizational tactical level priorities. So this is leadership talking about in the next fiscal year, here are themes that we have identified as crucial. All right, it's not too early in March or April to start to lay those out for the broader organization. And even though there's going to be unknowns, I strongly encourage the organization to go ahead and conduct a preliminary financial analysis, a look ahead with your best assumptions to set some high-level parameters around what we think the financial situation will look like in the coming year. Why? Because that's going to help inform the planning. You may only go as far as saying, guys, I think next year we don't know much. Let's assume flat. Or you might say, we have a lot of evidence that next year we're going to have some increases, so let's keep a 3% growth in mind. These are all the types of things that you want to think about at that point. When you get into May, get your process organized. When you get into June, kick it off. This is where you're going to get hands-on. Your managers are going to get involved. They're going to start working on their process, their business plans. Give them time, give them a month or so to work through that. During that process, preliminary reviews, dialogue with those managers, with leadership, feedback, constant communication and feedback. Finish up those business plans in July. As you get into August, go through a presentation process. Leadership should look at every single plan, provide more feedback, more dialogue, and then we can get into decision making. Leadership can now actually approve specific tactics, develop budget allocations, communicate the results out to the organization. Everything can be finalized and locked up so that we're solid. All of our pieces and plans are together. And then with that done, it's going to set us up to start the fiscal year and kick into then what I call, you're going to switch hats from planning over to executing and monitoring. Now, my screen may be lagging a little bit because I've already gone ahead and updated the next several steps. From there we go. They all just popped on. But to me, you don't have to memorize this, guys, because I'm going to give you this slide. But this, in my book, is optimal. It gets you ready for the year. Okay, so appreciate you guys listening to me. Let's get into our first poll. I want to ask you, by when would you like to have your FY21 planning complete? And I'm going to launch this poll. It means that for all of you, you have a chance to respond. And I'm just going to keep this open for a very, very brief amount of time for anybody who's on. Jump in here and vote for me. Do you want to have it done in June? That would put you in the early. Do you want to have it done in July? Still early. August? September? Or you know what? For whatever reason, I'm okay with October or later. All right. I'm going to keep it open here for a few more seconds. Get a couple more responses. Good. We've got them coming in. Okay. Let me get a couple more votes so we get a good data set here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to publish this so everybody can see. One thing I will say, because I know we have folks on that are in finance teams, a lot of them do not like September for doing the planning and budgeting because they're working on their fiscal year closeout, and I do understand that. So, all right, so we've got our votes in, and I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I'm going to share it. I think I'm doing this right. Let's hope that GoToMeeting is holding up its end of the bargain. And so we had a June response. We had a couple July. Our biggest winner was August. We had a September, and we had them okay with October or later. And so there is nothing wrong with any of those. Just like I said earlier, there's pros and cons to all of the above. So I appreciate you guys participating in that. We do have 2 more polls, so stay engaged with me here. All right, I'm going to hide that, and we're going to get back to our next tip. So thank you for that. Good to know. Good to hear. It just goes to show you that across organizations, you do have a diversity, if you will, of preferences for that. Okay, this is probably one of the more interesting slides and concepts that I think you might want to take away and get into some reflection in terms of really how does this apply for my organization. This idea of you've got to find the right balance between complexity, effort, and impact when it comes to how you're going to attack this annual planning. And this is fascinating. In this, I draw in a lot of my experience and study, things I used to coach and teach on related to organizational maturity, organizational readiness, business acumen, management preference. I mean, there's all these things that you have to know. You really need to know your organization, the temperature of your organization, the capacity of your organization so that you fine-tune your planning to meet the needs. And so what I want to show you guys here is sort of this relationship between complexity and effort and impact. And so we start with what I would call sort of a subset of business planning, the most basic version, and I'm calling that a budget call. And so that's terminology that may resonate with many of you. It's very resource focused. It's typically managed directly by a finance team, and it assumes stability. What I mean by that is this method works in an organization where if in the current year, we look ahead to the next year and we can say, mostly this organization is going to be the same. So budgeting is primarily about taking what we know this year and just projecting it forward to next year. And there's going to be some adjustments, there's going to be some cost increases, but there's not a lot of tactical planning going on in that framework. It's more of a last year, next year type of analysis, but it's lower in effort, requires less effort, and is relatively simple. Okay, so then we move up a level. We're going to add a little bit of effort and a little bit of complexity. And what I'm calling this is sort of a basic level of business planning. So we're going beyond a budget call. We're going to bring more data elements in. I'll give you one basic example. Some organizations in the budget call will not include staffing projections or FTE analysis. They leave it more toward true, just sort of cost type resource areas. If you move to more of a business planning model, even at the basic level, you're going to pull in more data elements. You're going to get more management involvement. Now, as a benefit of that, it's going to be more agile. Your planning process is going to be able to handle more variables, but it is increasing the complexity overall, and it does require more effort in order to make this happen. Okay, next, and our last sort of option here is what I'm calling a full business planning. This is a highly integrated planning model. It meets all of those things we talked about earlier, okay? It's inclusive, it's comprehensive, it's transparent, it's accurate, it's consistent, it's got all of those attributes, but it does require more effort and complexity. Now, here's the thing with this though. Decision-making becomes more driven by tactics, meaning if you build up to the capacity to handle this model, because it's more integrated, decision-making and budgeting becomes more by objective. So as a leadership team, you are setting things up to be able to say, out of the 20 things we know that this organization might be able to attack this year, these are the highest priorities. And by endorsing those, we know the resource requirements and commitments that go along with that. So this can be potentially transformative, either to help an organization change its direction or to completely reset the organization's financial health. So we have evidence that when a full business planning model is implemented, that an organization can substantially change its financial practice and outcomes from year to year, to include examples as extreme as eliminating a $30 million deficit in one fiscal year. So you need to know your organization's capacity and maturity to decide which of these is the right fit. Now, what I would encourage any organization to do is to start simple and then build progressively toward full business planning. Because the organizations are busy, there's a lot of competing priorities, your management tier may not be ready to embrace this. You probably want to start small and then build. But I would say that your organization will benefit from increasing your complexity, maturity, and effort over time. I'll tell you a story. I was talking to a CFO recently, and she was talking about looking forward to FY21, and her methodology was budget call. She made no confusion about that. Budget call was her method. But she said to me, the thing that really frustrates me is I collect this data, our departments, our services send in these control point or cost account requests for the year. And it's like they didn't really think. They just kind of put a number in. And then when we get into the year, we just have to constantly deal with changes and requests and, oops, I forgot this. And we forgot to talk about that. And it really burns a lot of time and a lot of effort and frustration for us through the year. And so my appeal to her was, well, maybe it's time for you to increase the sophistication of your planning, because even though it's going to take more effort and there's more complexity now, there's a huge payback later. It's going to save you a ton of time later when you get into the year, because you're going to be able to avoid constant change, constant churning and iteration of having to go back and rethink every resource allocation. And, because you planned more effectively. So there's certainly a very strong business case for moving toward a completely integrated business planning model. Note, when you look at it this way, a budget call is going to overall be the least impactful in terms of steering and changing, whereas the highest impact potential comes from a fully integrated effort. So here's some questions. I won't go through all of these necessarily, but just these are the things you should ask yourself when you're assessing your organization's maturity and readiness and how to tailor your planning approach. You can see in here, what are we doing today? What tools and processes do we currently have? Do we have a philosophy that leads more toward a simplified, centralized model or more decentralized? Are we proactive or reactive? Are we experiencing a ton of leadership turnover? My goodness, that is such a huge factor. I cannot believe how much leadership turnover most organizations seem to be undergoing. And it really makes it hard. As soon as you get something, someone comes in and then it's almost like inherently they're going to change everything just because they should. And I think that's where having something stable and predictable in place that is a win for everybody is very valuable for the organization. It's such a shame to see so much organizational knowledge lost every time there's a leadership transition. So if you're undergoing a lot of leadership turnover, you've really got to be aware of the impact of that. Do we have ownership? Do we have the resources to own these processes? Crucial question. Do our managers, do our directors, our chiefs, our administrators, do they have sufficient business acumen? I can tell you guys right now, when we're invited to come in and partner with an organization to do all of this, a lot of what we do is training. We're putting guys in the classroom, we're putting leaders in a classroom, and we're teaching them business planning 101, business acumen 101, and we're helping them to understand their data. That's a huge lift. What is the accuracy and availability of the data? And then is the organization communicating effectively? Vertically means obviously from leadership down to staff and back up, and horizontally is across the organization. Some organizations are just so siloed. You have these different services, departments, units, and they just don't talk. Or if they do, it's not done systematically. A classic example, I think most of the folks online know, we do a lot of work in healthcare with hospitals, and they just tend to be siloed. Over here, the surgery department's got this great idea to expand service, add some new, capacity, but then they didn't really talk to the facilities folks who need to know about increasing the space. They didn't really talk to the nursing folks, the nursing staff, because they're going to need nursing support in order to pull this off. So you really have to have an understanding of your organization in all of these dimensions so you can decide where you fit in your planning complexity. Okay, so I'm excited to ask you guys this one because I have opinions, but I think it really matters. You know your organization. We're going to open our next poll. So please let me know your answer on this. We're going to launch this poll. And my question for you is, what level of planning best fits your organization? And I use those three that we talked about: this basic budget call approach, the intermediate, sort of that middle of the road, or are you ready to go fully integrated? Is your organization prepared to go full on business planning, 100% all in? So let me keep this open just for a couple minutes, and I'd love to get as many votes as possible on this. So keep them coming. Very good. This is extremely helpful, guys. This poll data helps us learn. I will tell you, while I'm kind of watching these results filtering in here, that there is always going to be a spectrum of, where folks are ready. All right, let me see if we can get one or two more votes in here, and then I'm going to go ahead and publish it. Last call. All right, this is not surprising. This distribution, I get to see the results before you guys do. This distribution is pretty on point with what we got one last vote in. Nice job, you snuck it in before I clicked the button. This distribution is pretty much what I would have expected. So let's share those results on the screen. And hopefully they're coming up for you guys. Yep, there we go. So it's, a pretty predictable distribution. We've got some basic, and, on the other end, you've got those that are ready to go all in, and then down the middle is usually the majority. So thanks very much for sharing that. I appreciate that. Again, very illustrative. And I would just say, for those of you that are in that basic, the question would be, is there an opportunity to increase your sophistication? For those of you in the intermediate, is it working well for you? And for those that are in the fully integrated, I think the challenge is, how do you sustain it? I think that is the challenge. You know, amid many competing priorities, do you have the discipline, process, tools, and ownership to sustain it and get that full ROI out of your efforts? Okay, very good. Thank you. So let's move into our next tip. Let me get the slides going. All right. You are going to have a heck of a time having an effective planning experience unless you've got the right data on hand and you know, or you have a process, or your participants in this model have a way to make accurate projections. So let's dig into that. So what are relevant data points for this business planning, tactical planning, budget planning? There's a lot. This is one of the challenges. You've got all that top-down data that we talked about before. Organization-wide strategic goals, regional goals, local goals, key drivers, projects, initiatives, knowing your revenue, you know, that whole revenue projection and analysis and that preliminary affordable analysis. Those are all feeding the model, feeding the process. Then we've got the bottom up. This is all the data points that we're going to be collecting from across the organization to bring it into one integrated view. So there's planning aspects of that, tactical proposals. So imagine this is the data elements. This is the plan that each of those services or departments are going to be working on. They've got to do something when it comes to an action plan. They've got to do some kind of a workload analysis. You can't plan unless you have some inkling of workload interrelated with tactical planning and budgeting. If you divorce those things, it's just not going to make sense. What is the operational performance? There's some metrics on that. Things like make-buy types analysis. And then there's all the resource areas, and by no means is this inclusive. But these are some of the big dogs. Certainly FTE, we're going to talk about it. And salary going hand in hand with that. How do you make projections for that? How do you build a credible forward-looking plan that isn't just a mathematical projection? How do you build that up? And then look at all these other things. All of these are potentially significant cost areas for your organization. The overtime, the contracts you pay for, control points, meaning literally, like, think of them as the bank accounts where money is funded and spent. Travel, education, space, equipment, furniture. There's more. There's more than that. I just wanted to give you, enough. And so this is all needs to be included inside a business planning model, so that you can drive crucial outputs, even though these are all still data elements that need to be developed through the model, like a final revenue projection, those final cost projections. That's going to help you come up with a total overall financial impact. Just think about this for a second. If I am running an organization and I can tell you before the day that we start the new fiscal year that I've got a solid degree of confidence in my overall revenue, and I've done a very detailed budgeting exercise that has given me a solid degree of confidence, at least in a known scenario, for my costs. And I can say to you from day one, based on everything we've covered, I know that I am going into this year either financially solid and projected for a flat, no deficit, no surplus. I'm going to be financially balanced this year, or to go into the year knowing just by carrying in my costs today and based on my best revenue projection, I know that I am going to be looking at a $10, $20 million deficit for the year, but to have that built up systematically, how powerful is that? That's what we're getting at here. So I put this here to just show you guys the full menu of things that you're going to have to find a way to bring in if you want planning to be integrated, accurate, efficient, and effective. So when you look at all those areas, there's methods, right? For each of those resource areas, you've got to have an approach for developing projections. And remember, what I'm proposing to you guys here is a more distributed model. This is not just happening inside the finance team. Your managers are hands-on in this exercise. They're feeding the process. So for each resource area, we're going to need to equip those managers with actual year-to-date data. What was prior year data? What was their prior year budget? And then they're going to need the supporting detail behind that. So we need to give them that. They have to have that in front of them. And we're going to ask them in response to that to provide their projections for every single one of those resource areas that we discussed. Because not only that, we need to know where they think they're going to end the current year. If you're an early planner, you need to figure out where you're going to be at the end of this year. That's part of your projection. And then you're going to build on that by projecting next year as well. And then you need some sort of justification, or when I say tactical linkage, this goes back to, if we're not careful, our managers out there, our chiefs, our departments, they will always tell you they need more than they needed last year. And that's a frustration point. I completely recognize that can diminish the planning model, but that is completely avoidable. If your process requires them to justify, to substantiate, and expectations are set, you can completely avoid that. You can get meaningful, tactically driven projections for the coming year. Then there's different methods that you're going to use. Trend analysis, that's really just saying, what we did in the past and let's project it forward. It can be helpful. I do not recommend that as a single factor. Demand is more saying, well, what do we think is actually going to be needed based on what we think our community, our customer base, our patient base, what do we know about what they need? And so then we tailor our projection to align with that. The idea of correlating any projections to both your operational performance and workload, that's starting to look at ratios, the relationship between what resources have I had, and is there a link to the amount of work I produce, and is there a link to the quality, if you want to think of it that way, my operational performance? Am I meeting my metrics? Am I meeting my standards? So bringing those in is crucial. Comparative analysis, that's sort of a version of benchmarking, or at least analogous estimating, if you want to look at it that way. And then last in my list here, but certainly not least, is budgeting by objective. And that is the most mature method. Again, that goes back to show me what you're planning to do, demonstrate the resources tied to that, and I make decisions through that methodology, not just strictly through budget projections. So when all of that comes together, and as a financial leader, as an administrator, as an executive team member, with that said, you're going to want to look at the outliers, the ones that stand out. What are the big leaps from last year? What are the big declines from last year? Go right to that. It's a great place to jump right in and start, right? What are the justifications? What is the alignment? Am I seeing, I talked to a CFO once and he nailed it for me. He said it just exactly the way I had thought, and he said it better than I had ever thought it. The majority of an organization from year to year is what we're going to call sustaining operations. And at that manager level, there's going to be fantastic ideas. There's no doubt about it. But an organization only can support a small percentage of those each year. So alignment is all about carrying forward the current mission. Now, you don't want to discourage good ideas from coming through, but you really want to look at that core first, and then you build on that and saying, okay, is there anything else that was proposed that really is going to move the needle for this organization? Benchmarking is going to help you. And then, of course, that whole budget by objective concept. Okay. Now, I'm going to blow through this, but you cannot understate how important it is to have FTE inside your business planning model, to look at this carefully every year. For most organizations, FTE is the largest cost. And so what I observe is a lot of times a salary projection or a staffing projection is strictly financial. So you look at, what you've been paying for, there's a couple of variables you sprinkle in, and then you project it forward. But I'm going to make a case to you guys that there's a way to do that more effectively and accurately, which is to build it up through the business planning process. And when you do that, every single department or entity in your organization is going to look at who's on board today, what are my vacant positions, when do I expect them to be filled? I have to have a time dimension. Are there any new positions I'm proposing through this process? Are any of those actually approved? We need to know that. What's turnover look like? What's the lag? How long does it take to fill positions? And then what other adjustments are needed? If you do this systematically, you will have a fantastic integrated staffing, salary, FTE projection against which leadership can conduct decision making and budgeting. All right. Getting in the home stretch here, only 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go fast. Tip number 5, you've got to communicate clear decisions. If there's one thing you can do to screw up a planning process, it's to go through all the planning stuff, do all the hard work, get all your managers involved, and then stop. And it really drives me nuts, guys, because I see this happen. I see leaders, because there are difficult decisions to be made, and they get gun shy. And unfortunately, that is the worst case scenario of all. Sometimes I honestly wonder if an organization would just be better flying blind than partially doing in this, engaging in a model like this, and then never making any decisions. You've got to make some decisions. So the types of questions as a leader that you have to ask: is this department that's bringing this business plan forward meeting its expectations? Is it managing its budget effectively today? Right? What is needed to sustain performance? What is needed to improve performance? Is it only a resource question, or is it an efficiency question? Is there alignment? Is there cohesion? Is it an integrated plan? And were there any, again, objectives or initiatives that demonstrated positive ROI? If I look at those things, I am now positioned to provide true feedback in the form of an approved plan with a budget tied to it. Specifically approved objectives. There may be many that are unapproved. That's okay. A detailed budget for every area and any other performance expectations. Clarity is essential. Any single one of us just wants to know what's expected of us and what resources we have to work with, even if we don't like it. That's my big sales pitch for you guys today, okay? That's the tip that you can tell I'm passionate about, because if you're going to spend the time doing this stuff, finish the job. It's in your service. It's in the organization's service. It's in your manager's service. Even if there's a few difficult conversations sprinkled in along the way, that is part of being a leader. All right, last tip. You've got to be ready to adjust, to execute, a monitor, and adjust. You go through all this planning, well, you better be prepared to do something about it. So you've got to be ready for this. As you get ready to cross into FY21, you're going to need some things. You're going to need data. You're going to need your targets, those budget targets that were established. You're going to need to be able to see year-to-date versus budget, plan, projected versus budget, the burn rates for certain resource areas, and you're going to need detail. And that's not just for you as an administrator or as a financial manager. That is for our service managers, chiefs, department managers. They need to be looking at this stuff. They're the ones making the day-to-day decisions. So we have to have a way to present that data to them. Tools. Keeping up with what our revenue projections are, progress tracking on all those tactical objectives that were built into this model, being able to do scenario analysis, because things are going to change. We need sound methods for projections. We need reports, and we need to be able to track adjustments. We know that no plan is perfect, and absolutely guaranteed there will be changes, adjustments, and the unforeseen along the way. I think we all know that we've had a terrible example of that this year with the pandemic. Nobody could have predicted that, and everybody had to adjust. It's an extreme example, but an example nonetheless. And then lastly, process. How are you as an organization really keeping up with these things? Do you have a monthly budget process where you look at financial performance? How do you conduct those? Are there true, I'm going to say more true performance reviews, where on a quarterly or semi-annual basis, you sit with your departments and you really say, yeah, you know, here's your budget performance, but what's your workload look like? What's the trajectory been? What's your outcomes? Are they meeting standards? Do those things tell a story together? Because something has changed, the unknown, is there a process for submitting updated plans, for evaluating change requests? How does a resource board integrate to that? For most organizations, a resource board simply means the body that has the governance authority to make mid-year decisions. And then how do you make sure that any adjustments do in fact flow back to those departments and services? Okay, last poll question for today as we come near a close. And I'd love to know, so we talked about needing a lot of things, tools, data, processes. So my question for you guys is, how automated is your current planning process? Are you not automated? Are you basically dealing with emails and, spreadsheets 100%? Partially, so that would be, some guys have spreadsheets with macros and some nice reports, a shared workspace, maybe like a SharePoint site. And then we've got fully automated, which is everything together in one planning solution. You can handle all this stuff, the data that goes in, the data that comes out, being able to track, being able to monitor. Okay, we're going to keep this open for about another 30 or so seconds. Let me get a couple more votes. Got a good turnout so far, but I'd love to get a couple more. All right, guys. Good, good, good. All right. Going, and gone. Let me publish our results. How automated? Looks like most folks are somewhere down the middle. That's what I would expect. Okay, so just know that we talked about effectiveness and we talked about efficiency. And so tools are imperative to that. You really do need to have good tools to save time. I've worked with organizations where they've got analysts in the front office and the management team and the finance team literally running around having to collect this data, send the data. Then is the question, is anybody looking at the data? Is anybody validating the data? And it can become very resource intensive, all right? And that can be a reason why an organization settles for an unsophisticated planning process. Now, promised you no sales pitch. I do want to tell you guys that our whole business model is that we work with organizations to automate and teach this entire process. And so we do have a planning platform that addresses essentially everything I covered today, from the planning side, let the screen catch up here, to the monitoring side. Come on, screen. We're almost done, guys. All I want to do is get through the last couple slides, get you on your way. To the planning side, the monitoring side, we have that. So all I would say is, if that is of interest to you, if you do not have that as a resource today, I'm going to leave you with my contact information. Please give me a call and we can show you how we do it. All right. I think my screen finally moved and caught up. And so let me share with you a couple last key considerations that I think you'll find helpful. Avoid the dreaded wish list. I don't think my screen's caught up, but hey, you know what? Just finish this off. You've got to set expectations. You don't want your departments coming in and presenting a bunch of ridiculous requests that are not helpful to the organization. Strongly encourage fostering inter-department collaboration. I mentioned it earlier, breaking down silos. Okay, you've got to have a leadership team that's on the same page. There's nothing worse than that when the executive in charge is one thing in their mind and the associate director, COO has something else in mind, and this chief over here, it hurts. So really, when we go back to that complexity and model, getting everybody on the same page is crucial. And then we really need to demonstrate to our management tier that because they're willing to engage in this, because they're playing a huge part, they're putting work into building business plans, to being good managers, that there is a payoff for them. And like I said earlier, at a minimum, that payoff is in the form of clarity and feedback going into the year. Better than that is that over time, you can give them more freedom to actually manage. You can become more distributed. You can say to them, here's your budget, go out and conquer. I don't have to micromanage you, and that's good for the entire organization. Being fully integrated, making sure you don't have planning processes that bump into each other, or like I said, strategic planning in one lane, budget planning in another lane, project planning in another lane. Very, very inefficient. And then start small. If you're not where you want to be, start small, build success, and then you add complexity as the organization matures. So we don't have much time left, but did anybody have any questions? I don't think I saw any through the chat. Any comments through the chat that anybody wants to share? Any comments? You're welcome to do that. While you do, if anybody has that, I will go ahead and just share with you here at the end that my contact information is here. Well, we've got a summary of our tips, right? It wouldn't be a good webinar if I didn't remind everybody. Get the right people involved. Optimize that timeline for your organization. Be smart about balancing the way you approach planning to the right degree of complexity, effort, and impact. Get that data together that you need so you can do this accurately and arm your managers with the tools and capability to make good projections. Make decisions and communicate them, and then make sure you're ready to execute. So with all that said, I would very much like to thank you all for being a part of this session today, for listening in, for engaging with those polls. That was awesome. Much appreciated. At the end of the day, I think if you can use these methods for FY21, even one of them, I hope it'll prompt some thinking and reflection on your part, or even some very specific tactical things that you can do that'll help you get ready for 21. I know, again, many of you have been very busy, very overwhelmed. This has been a difficult year, but do not neglect to look ahead. The horizon is there. Yes, there's been a lot of stress and a lot of need to change based on the pandemic and other things, but FY21 is coming, and so do not neglect to take the opportunity to plan. That is our mission. So final slide here is simply our contact information. So I will end with a thanks. We'll stay on the line just for a minute in case there were any other final questions. Otherwise, be on the lookout for an email that has the materials, if you didn't already grab them from the webinar, and the recording. And please feel free to share it with any of your colleagues that might find this beneficial. Otherwise, thank you all. Have a great day. Stay safe and healthy, and look forward to keeping in touch. Take care.